Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem, and today we'll talk about the rather touchy subject of the vocal forces used in the music of Bach. Sometimes, a new theory is so contrary to what we used to believe that we just don't want to believe it. This is what happened 40 years ago when Joshua Rifkin presented a theory according to which the performance of Bach's cantatas mostly involved a small vocal ensemble of only 4 singers, and not a larger choir as was assumed. In the following decades, while some scholars rejected and ridiculed this idea, others continued the research. These days, the dispute has calmed down, and this idea has become accepted among many scholars and performers. In this episode, we will look into the details of the subject, which uncover a lot of interesting information about the performance practices of Lutheran music in the 18th century. Let's start. In the search for answers regarding the vocal forces used in the performance of Bach's vocal music, a central piece of evidence is a letter from 1730 by Bach himself to the town council of Leipzig. As director of the 55 pupils of the St. Thomas School, the Thomasschule, Bach was in charge of supplying music for no less than 5 churches in the city. He explains the difficulties in supplying the required musical services due to the lack of able students, both in quality and quantity, and also because some of the students regularly acted as instrumentalists, since the regularly paid instrumentalists of the church were either not adequate in level or simply too few. This document, which in modern scholarship has resulted in a great deal of confusion and raised many questions, is referred to as the Entwurf, the draft, where Bach outlines what would be needed in order to avoid further decline in the music under his leadership. After explaining that the pupils of the school, aged between 13 to 20 more or less, were divided into 4 groups, sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses, he wrote, "In order that the choirs for church pieces be correctly constituted, as is befitting, the vocalists must be divided further into 2 sorts, namely Concertists and ripienists." The definitions and function of the Concertists and ripienists might be the most central point of the entire debate. This concept goes back to around 1600 in Italy, when a new way of combining voices and instruments took shape. While in the older tradition, instruments were often added to vocal compositions by simply joining or replacing existing vocal parts, in the new tradition, the instruments received dedicated instrumental parts that were independent from the vocal parts of the piece. This included an independent basso continuo line as well as different instrumental parts. Such pieces were often called simply concerti or concerti ecclesiastici in the case of sacred pieces for the church. The singers singing in these pieces were called concertists, or sometimes favoriti, the favored or selected singers. In modern terms, we would simply refer to them as soloists. In pieces for many parts, in addition to the choir of concertists, there was a possibility to add, at certain points, further supporting singers and instruments. These were called ripieni, and as a group they were often called the cappella. This practice started in Italy but was soon found also in Germany. Here is how Praetorius describes concertists in 1619. "I call them voces concertatas, or preferably concertantes, which respond to each other, so to speak, struggling among themselves to see who can outdo the other. Consequently, for such parts, one must select the best singers, who are not only perfect and secure, but who possess a good disposition for singing in the current new manner, and who pronounce the words correctly and clearly as if reciting an oration." And here is how he describes the ripienists. "And so, the ripieni are nothing other than certain portions of a concerto in which other choirs at times enter in with the principal choir to make a full ensemble. The addition of a ripieno cappella is essentially optional. to the extent that those pieces whose title indicates the number of voices often give two numbers. For example, Praetorius's piece Gelobet und Gepreiset is titled for 5 voices and for 9 voices. Praetorius explains, the first number means the concertato voices, which are the foundation of the whole concerto. The following numbers, however, indicate the additional instrumental voices or cappella parts, which are there only as circumstances allow, for adornment and a fuller ensemble, and which can be completely omitted if musicians are lacking. Here you can hear the 5 concertists accompanied only by basso continuo, and now the vocal and instrumental cappella join. In this case, the ripieni parts sometimes double the concertists' parts exactly and sometimes not. In other cases, the ripieni are an exact doubling of the main voices. It is important to note that this new concerto genre did not eradicate the older style of more traditional polyphony. The two styles existed together. For example, while Monteverdi is best known today for his pieces in concerto style, such as his Magnificats, he also wrote pieces such as his Masses in the older style. In some sources, these pieces in the older style, which are sometimes labeled with titles such as Da Cappella or Alla Breve, are said to have the option of being performed with ripieni throughout, with the vocal parts copied out again and doubled by a second or even third set of singers and instruments. There is a logic in the fact that pieces in the concerto genre, with their more soloistic nature and quicker note values, were left principally to soloists, with optional ripieno cappella joining only at certain simpler moments, while pieces in the older style, which are less virtuosic by nature, could be performed by ripienists throughout. You must be asking yourself, how are all these very interesting 17th century practices relevant to the performance of music by Bach, which took place in the following century? Well, these traditions stayed relevant to Lutheran practices even up to the time of Bach. Motets in the old style, referred to sometimes as in stile antico, were performed regularly in churches, also by the pupils of Bach. And the genre of the cantata, which is our main focus, was essentially the 17th century concerto, including its use of ripieni. Let's see. Before getting into the issue of ripieni singers in the music of Bach, it is important to note that only the most select pupils of Bach in the Thomasschule took part in the performance of his cantatas. The remaining body of student musicians was in charge of performing stile antico motets, which could have been performed by most of the students since they were simpler than the cantatas, and also chorales, which even the most unmusical students could have performed. We actually know what motets the pupils of the Thomasschule sang in the time of Bach. They used a collection of motets published in the early 17th century, most of which are for 2 choirs, specifically for 8 voices. Aside from the fact that Bach was in charge of performing what could be described as his era's version of early music, the number 8 is important. In his Entwurf, Bach tells us that the pupils of the school are divided into 4 choirs or groups, attached to different churches and according to their level, and that in each group there should be at least 3 boys of each voice type, that is, a total of 12 singers. The reason, Bach explains, is that even if one person falls ill, as very often happens, and particularly at this time of year, at least a 2-choir motet can be sung. In other words, by having 12 pupils, even if some are ill or absent, at the very least a motet of 8 voices could be performed. Bach then adds that if there were 16 pupils, it would be even better in that regard. This wish for 12 or even 16 pupils is in contrast to the actual state of things in the school at that time, where each group had only 8 singers. In modern research, This passage from the Entwurf has been used by both sides of the argument, with one side saying that this proves that Bach wanted 16 singers in his choir, therefore having a choir similar to a modern chamber choir. The other side claims that all Bach wanted was to ensure a situation where there would be at least 8 singers, who were able to sing an 8-voice motet with one singer per part. Whichever side you find more compelling, none of this actually tells us how many singers took part in the performance of Bach's own church music, his cantatas and passions. Some things, however, are clear, so we might as well get them out of the way. The custom of soloists who sing their solos and then sit down while a choir sings their own parts was never the case in Bach's time. It seems that 4 selected singers, the Concertists, sang throughout the entire cantata, their arias and recits, as well as what we call choir sections or choruses. The question that remains, however, is whether there were ripienists who joined in with the soloists for some sections, and whether this is then similar to what we see today as in a small chamber choir. Let's see. Though rare, there are some cantatas by Bach where ripienists are called for. The way we know this is because in addition to the concertists' parts, there are further parts especially for the ripienists. For example, what we call solo cantatas, where after some solo arias and recits a 4-part chorale appears, are often given titles such as for 4 voices, or actually for tenor solo and 3 ripieni, or alto solo and 3 ripieni voices. As you can see here, for example, in this alto solo cantata, the chorale is included in the last page of the soloist's part. So, when it comes, after singing his soloistic movements, he stays to sing the chorale, and the 3 ripienists join, so that the 4 singers are singing 4 parts. Let's listen to the end of the recit and beginning of the chorale. If we want to claim that the chorale was sung by a bigger choir of more than 4 singers, some things don't add up. The title should have been for alto solo and 4 or more ripienists. There should have been a separate alto ripieno part with the chorale. And lastly, since there is only 1 copy per voice, we would have to assume that the ripieno singers shared their copies, a practice which is not really supported in sources. Some have suggested that the ripieni singers stood next to the concertists and read from their copy according to a cue from the conductor, but in sources describing ripieni, they are always situated further away from the concertists. Then there are the more common cantatas that alternate between sections for 4 voices, what we call choir sections or choruses, and sections for 1 voice, arias and recits. From 150 such pieces from which we have surviving parts, only 9 have ripieni parts. A nice example is cantata Gott ist mein König, composed and performed in 1708. On the top of the score, we see a title in the formula that Praetorius used, for 18 parts, or, if you wish, for 22. That is, there are 18 parts, as we see from the score, 4 of which are singers. At the bottom of this score, we see the word capella, along with a wavy line, signifying the 4 additional voices which are not on the score. The capella is of course the group of ripienists, who stand separately from the 4 concertists and have 4 separate parts of their own. Here is a contemporary source from 1706 that explains again what a capella is. Capella is used when, in vocal music, a separate choir joins in certain sections for the splendor and strengthening of the music. It must therefore be separately positioned in a place apart from the concertists. With a shortage of people, however, these capellas can even be left out, because they are in any case already also sung by the concertists. Looking at the ripieno parts of Bach's cantata, we see that indeed they join the parts of the concertists at certain moments, and then leave them to sing by themselves. Let's listen to the beginning of the cantata following the two vocal bass parts, the concertist's part and the ripienist part. The next movement is a duet for soprano and tenor, so the ripieni are silent. The following one is a choir section, that is, it is written for 4 voices, but still the ripieni are asked to stay silent. They remain silent in the following bass solo and alto solo movements. In the next one, however, they sing throughout. Nice. In the final movement, they don't sing the whole time, but, just as in the first movement, coming and going in a varied manner. In addition to the 9 cantatas with surviving ripieni parts, there are 5 cantatas with no such parts, but where some indications, such as markings of tutti and soli, are written on the score or in some of the parts, probably implying where ripienists should join. While this practice of ripieni is already quite different from our modern concept of a choir, both in its function and its forces, if we wanted to conclude that Bach used something similar to a modern choir in his other cantatas, we have to assume that, from the 141 cantatas that were preserved with parts, all the ripieni parts were lost. That Bach didn't find it important to give any indication on any of the scores that ripieni should be used. Such indications are not only for us, but for his helpers who produced the parts. And again, that ripieni singers were sharing copies, either amongst themselves or behind the shoulders of the concertists. Some musicians nowadays believe that all or most of the choruses in Bach cantatas were meant to have an additional 4 or 8 ripieni singers, and that in Bach's time there was no time or need to mention this. As you see, the issue is rather complicated. We should mention, however, that as far as the orchestra is concerned, Bach is rather clear. He calls for at least 11 strings, and then further oboes, bassoon, trumpets, and other instruments. Before letting you go, I want to share some further sources that suggest that only 4 young singers, together with many instruments, seems to have been a common practice. Let's see. The renowned Collegium Musicum in Leipzig, an appreciated musical society that was directed by Johann Kuhnau and later by Telemann and Bach, was said around 1710 to be not only very strong in numbers, but also excellent to hear. It consisted of circa 40 musicians, from which only 4 were singers. This ensemble sometimes performed church music in the Neue Kirche in Leipzig. This distribution of only a few singers versus many instrumentalists is consistent with several musical institutions from that time. In 1740, the composer and theorist from Leipzig, Johann Scheibe, wrote the following: "If there happen to be trumpets and kettle drums in the musical ensemble, one should hide them as much as possible and place them behind all the other instruments if one does not wish their rattling sounds to obscure harmony and melody, as well as singers and instruments." He even adds, "The vocal parts should also, where possible, have more than 1 to a part, because the choruses otherwise make no impact." First, we get a tip of how to situate the musicians in order to avoid the instruments obscuring the voices. This is a point that is repeated in other sources and really makes a difference when compared to the typical practice nowadays, when the singers are usually situated behind the orchestra. Then, by asking that more singers should join, Scheibe implies that normally or by default they were indeed one singer per voice. But in the case of loud music, where possible, one should add more. Interestingly, this is exactly what we saw in Bach's cantata Gott ist mein König, as well as in a later cantata from his time in Leipzig, Wir danken dir Gott, where both trumpets and ripieni singers were indeed added. Was it a big choir with several singers per voice that sings all the choruses throughout? No, it was 4 more singers, maybe 8 if one assumes copy sharing, who joined when they were told to. 1 month after Bach's death, the rector of a school in Osnabrück, only 70 kilometers from Leipzig, was quite clear on how many singers should take part in performances. Referring to some new cantatas by Telemann, he writes in a letter, "If he finds a tutti, he should use just 1 singer, and of course the best of each voice. It sounds beautiful if one hears just 1 bass, tenor, alto, and treble. Whereas if everybody is shouting indiscriminately, it is nothing but the bleating of a flock of sheep." Of course, these might imply that there was also a practice of singing with more than 1 singer per part, but we can see what this author thought of it. As we said in our episode about iconography, this is rather flimsy as a science, but it's sure fun to look at some images. In this engraving of musicians in the Cathedral of Freiberg from circa 1710, we see many performers. In the center, we see what looks like no less than 7 concertists, and on the side an additional 4 singers, probably the ripieni capella. In this engraving of musicians in a church in Munich from circa 1715, we see 4 or 6 singers in the middle and many instrumentalists around them. In this engraving of an event in Hamburg from 1719, we see many instrumentalists and only 4 or 5 singers in the front. And finally, in this colored engraving from circa 1750, possibly from Augsburg, we see a room full with instrumentalists, but only 4 young singers. How cute! It is almost funny how many times Bach's Entwurf has come up again and again in this discussion, although it's clear that this is just an organizational paper that barely discusses the subject that we are interested in. It is now clear that a reading of it must include a critical distinction between different repertoires, concerted music versus traditional music, between the different functions of the different choirs under Bach's supervision, from which only one performed his own music, and between a simple institutional choir list and an actual vocal lineup for a certain piece. Joshua Rifkin, who came up with this 1 per part theory 40 years ago, used an analogy comparing the listing of singers with a sports team. On the photos, all the players are present, but in the game, only some are actually playing at one given moment. As a last source, I'd like to quote the Singers' Rulebook of Darmstadt, prepared in 1721, that stresses this point. And as not everyone can be used in the musical performance in church, only those who are necessary each time in the music should go up into the organ loft. The others should proceed to their proper places in order. All this evidence, as convincing or unconvincing as you find it, is probably relevant mainly to Bach's time and place, and surely exceptions often took place. Other contexts, other countries, and other times had even more varied practices. When Mendelssohn performed Bach's Mass Passion in 1829, for example, he had a choir of 158 singers, all of whom had their own parts, by the way. Nowadays, of course, musicians do what they find most fitting, according to their understanding, aesthetics, local acoustics, organ at hand, and many other factors. If you are interested in more details, do check the works of Andrew Perrott, without whose useful book I wouldn't have been able to make this episode. This was our episode about Bach's choir. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. If you enjoy early music sources, consider supporting us on Patreon. Comment, share, and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.